I want to talk to you guys about something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. So I remember back, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, Glenn Greenwald had a debate with, I forget who it was. It was some journalist, maybe a New York Times journalist, and they had an interesting back and forth on the nature of the media. And Glenn's claim, to sum it up, is that really there's no such thing as unbiased media. That's a total misnomer. It's not humanly possible to be unbiased. And I remember reading that argument at the time and thinking, well, that's ridiculous, because all people want and all you should want is somebody to give you facts, data, information, news, and just give you an information, just give you the landscape of, hey, here's what's going on right now, and then you do with that information whatever you want. And now, the older I've gotten and the more I've been involved in media, the more I realize Glenn is actually 100% right. So here's what I mean by that. Unbiased media it's impossible because everybody has a perspective. Now, you can be open and upfront and honest with what your perspective is, or you might not even realize that you have a perspective, but you do have a perspective. Everybody has a perspective, whether you know it at the conscious level or if it's at the subconscious level. And so what you see in corporate media, for example, you have generally careerists, people who are trying to climb that ladder, and you have people who have gone to the right schools, and to get hired, there's a system of filtering where you only get hired if you're not going to rock the boat too much. You only get hired if they're relatively, the powers that be, the status quo, the corporations, the advertisers, the political parties, they're relatively comfortable with what you're going to say on air. So the bias of corporate media would be a pro-establishment bias, to some extent, although there's variation, a pro-status quo bias. Of course, you have MSNBC, they're biased in favor of the Democratic Party. Fox News, biased in favor of the Republican Party. CNN is biased in favor of the Democratic Party. And so it's not unbiased. They're very biased. Now, you can maybe come up with an example that's less egregious, PBS, NPR, but the people who work there, they're better, perhaps, than the people at CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, but they also have biases. So a reporter might be relatively liberal, or their personal experience and their personal lives might influence the way they see the world. So now, don't get me wrong, you can and should, if there's a trusted outlet, they should give you news, facts, information, data first. Like, all of that has to come first. And then they can give their opinion on it. But also, just what you decide to cover is in and of itself going to reflect your bias. So there's no such thing as media without perspective. Being in the media necessitates you have some sort of perspective, some sort of framework, some sort of structure and ideology to view the world through. And so you're going to gravitate towards certain stories and gravitate away from other stories. And so everybody has a perspective. And what you need to do is, number one, make sure they're actually giving you the facts first. But number two, you should only trust the outlets that are upfront with what their ideological presuppositions are. And that's where I think almost everybody fails. Like, there's maybe 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever, of people, not just in old media, but also in new media, really let you know up front, like, hey, just so you know, this is generally where I fall on the political spectrum. This is a label or multiple labels that let you know where I fall on the political spectrum. And then you'll understand when you see the coverage. Yes, like for me, for example, I'm going to give you facts. I'm going to give you data. I'm going to give you information. I'm going to give you what I think is a fair, objective reading of a situation. But then also you're going to notice, there's only so many stories I could cover in the number of shows I do per week. So it's like, yeah, maybe I'm missing something here or there. And the things that I end up covering are going to be informed, whether or not I realize it and whether or not I even want it to be informed by my own ideological perspective. So you guys have heard me talk about it 1,000 times on my show, but the broad general labels that I think would apply to me and are fair to ascribe to me would be social democrat, So I think the Scandinavian systems have figured out a way to do government and the economy that's just significantly better than the more hardcore free market capitalist systems or corporatist systems around the world. I think it's fair to refer to me as populist left. I think even libertarian socialist applies. There was one political compass test that described my politics as that. I took another political compass test. They called me like a classic Marxist or something to that effect. Another term that I personally like is I'm an international moderate or centrist, because I do think my opinions are smack dab in the middle of mainstream opinion globally to a certain extent. And certainly in the United States of America, you know, if you poll the majority of the population, I'm with most Americans on most issues. So I think I think to be upfront and honest with what my ideological perspective is, and then also give you facts, information, data, and let that stuff come first, that's as good as you're ever going to get in media. And beware people who try to tell you, oh, I have no bias. And maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic by saying unbiased media is impossible. Really what I should say is media without a perspective is impossible. Because again, even just the decisions that you're going to make for what to cover is going to reflect your ideological presuppositions. So, you know, on my show, what are the things that I gravitate towards? Well, it's very clear. You know, first and foremost, I care about the working class. So I cover a lot of union stuff. I care deeply about wages. I care deeply about healthcare. That's reflected in my coverage. I care deeply about foreign policy. That's reflected in my coverage. Yes, I all the time beat up on public figures who I think are relatively odious, who are spewing right-wing misinformation. Now, yeah, sometimes I'll go after what I think is left-wing misinformation as well. I just don't think there's as much left-wing misinformation as you get from the likes of whoever it may be. Sean Hannity, Alex Jones, Ben Shapiro, fill in the blank. So, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend and lie to you guys and say like, you know, you come here and all you're getting is dry facts and all you're getting is information. Yes, I am going to give you news, facts, information, data, give you as objective a picture as I could possibly paint, but I also have a perspective. And you can agree with that perspective or disagree with that perspective. But what I'm not going to do is lie to you and say I don't have a perspective and I don't have an ideology. And the main takeaway from this that you should realize is everybody has an ideology. Even if you don't think you have an ideology, you have an ideology. If we have a conversation that's long enough, or I make you take one of the political compass tests or 4 of the political compass tests, you're going to fall somewhere on the spectrum. There's going to be a label that if it doesn't perfectly describe you, it pretty accurately describes you, but you do fall somewhere. There is some description out there that can accurately describe your ideological framework and your perspective. So nobody is perfectly objective without any perspective. Everybody has an ideological framework, whether or not you even realize it. And all you can do to the best of your ability to be responsible and honest and accurate in this space that I happen to be in is, to the best of my ability, I take whatever stories I think are interesting, and then I learn about them, I share them with you guys. I try my best to give you news, facts, data, information, and objectivity, so make it as dry and straightforward as possible. But then, yes, of course, I'm going to give you my take on it, my opinion on it, which is deeply informed by my own ideological perspective. But again, the point is, everybody does that, whether or not they even realize they're doing that. So I think that's important, and I think more people need to understand that, because it gives you better media literacy to understand that as well. It gives you a better understanding of the media landscape. So do with that information whatever you will, but understand it really is true that there's no such thing as unbiased media, or at the very least, there's no such thing as media without a perspective, because even the people who don't think they have a perspective definitely have a perspective. Final point. I think probably the best example of this is what's called in a derogatory way the enlightened centrists. There's this certain category of new media political pundit that they fancy themselves as like, I'm sort of above the fray, I'm not left or right, I'm just, super rational or whatever they might think of themselves. And they just think they've sort of stepped out of the traditional paradigm and there's no label that applies to them and there is no ideological framework. But to claim a lack of an ideological framework is certainly part of an ideological framework. And the enlightened centrists are actually not that hard to figure out and not that difficult to decipher. And it definitely, that perspective definitely leads them to care more about certain stories than others, cover certain stories over others. And, they might think that they're above the fray, but there's also no such thing as above the fray. So anyway, that's my breakdown on this. I think it's a really interesting topic and an interesting thing to think about. Just remember that as you consume various stuff in the media landscape, there is no such thing as unbiased media. Everybody has a perspective, whether or not they even realize it. And even if at the bare minimum, it's reflected just in what they choose to cover. So in other words, they could give you just facts and information, but there's certain things you're covering, certain things you're not covering. So in that process of determining what gets left out on the cutting room floor, your ideological framework is going to lead you to make certain decisions over others. So anyway, there you have it. On this show, I like to wear everything on my sleeve, and then you guys can determine whether or not you like it, you dislike it, you think it's fair or unfair. But one thing I can promise you is I'm never going to try to hide or bury my own perspective, my own biases. I'll be upfront with them and then let everybody else determine, whether or not I'm credible to talk on certain issues.